So let me quickly introduce Natalie Noonan. At Microsoft, Natalie part of the global black belt team dedicated to help the customer maximize their investment and also meet their compliance and the legal obligations. And for today's topic, Natalie will talk about adapt and thrive, keeping pace with the cloud compliance controls.
Okay, thanks for having me here today, and thanks for that introduction, Brian. Today, I'd like to focus on some of the trends that we're seeing in compliance as companies are adapting to new ways of working during COVID-19. Essentially, this has meant an accelerated move to cloud services and adjusting to a remote everything model to support the needs of our customers and our workforce. For example, we now have over 300 million office workers working from home. We have teachers and students that are adjusting to virtual classrooms. Some of us are even working with our healthcare providers via online consultations and sharing personal and medical information through cloud-based tools. While that adaptability is necessary and has enabled our businesses to stay relevant, we're coping with the new types of information and cybersecurity risks. And frankly, many companies are now trying to play catch up. They're looking to reconfigure their processes and strengthen their security and compliance controls so they can safeguard their data and their intellectual property while still supporting a positive company culture. So what are some of these challenges that we're facing in this environment, and really how do we keep up? For years now, we've been tracking the rapid growth of data and increasing communications channels. And now with our remote workforce, we have employees creating and sharing and storing data everywhere and in different ways than they had before. So with Microsoft, you may be familiar with platforms like Teams or heard a lot about Zoom lately. And we're using these types of tools to communicate with our internal and external colleagues and our customers, but they're different and they're more chat-based and dynamic and informal types of communications. And while this is all valuable to enable productivity and innovation and help keep us all more engaged, we still have an obligation to provide those services in a secure and compliant manner. So another trend that we see is our regulatory obligations and their complexity are really increasing. At that micro level, we have over 220 updates a day from over 1,000 regulatory bodies globally. At a macro level, some of these regulations, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, required really massive changes and introduced requirements that were inherently different than the controls we may have had in place before. Now we need to identify where personal and sensitive data resides so that it can be protected, or so that we can look across our large data state in response to data subject requests. We're being asked to comply with principles like data minimization, and we maybe used to be in a culture of saving data forever, where we now must dispose to get rid of that information of low value but high risk. And the understanding the data dependencies in these types of obligations and the relationships across our data is really non-trivial. And so we understand that translating these requirements into internal processes and controls is really one of our biggest challenges. An example of this, if we think about how legal and compliance and privacy officers all really understand the regulations well, and they author many of our compliance policies and standards. And on the other side, our IT professionals really know and can help configure our technologies. But sometimes these requirements get lost in translation, and we aren't always aware of the capabilities of the tools we already have. And often we even see companies buying multiple tools that do the same thing, adding a lot of cost and complexity. And ultimately, we really need these teams to be working together to solve for information risks, to maximize their existing investments, to really be able to simplify by integrating and connecting their environments so that it can be more practical and efficient and scalable. And finally, another critical way that we're trying to solve for these needs now is by leveraging intelligence and machine learning and automation. For example, as employees, I think we've all proven that we do a poor job of manually classifying data. And now we need to look at our information from many different compliance requirements. And that's only more disruptive to the business. So we're looking at our content and wondering, is it a record? What type of record? Who owns it? Does it have sensitive or personal data in it? How is it classified? Who can I share it with? Where can it be stored? There's really too much data flowing in and too many decision points like this and too much confusion for us to rely on manual classification. So there's really, I think, a core belief and a trend here that we need to leverage automation and remove that manual labor from this equation to be successful. So what is different about defining our compliance controls in the cloud is understanding shared responsibilities in compliance between the cloud provider and the cloud customer. In an on-prem environment, companies have the complete responsibility to protect their data, manage their infrastructure, and implement controls that complied with their regulatory standards. And in cloud services, a significant set of these controls are really shifted to the cloud service provider. So if we think of something like the NIST 853 privacy and security framework, within that there is about 1,200 expected controls. And in a cloud environment, when customers use Microsoft, for example, this shifts to more of an 80-20 rule, with Microsoft managing about 80% of those controls, but the customer responsible for still about 20% of them. So in that scenario, of course, you want visibility into how, whether it's Microsoft or any other cloud service, how they've implemented and tested those controls so that you can trust that cloud service before you move your data to the cloud. And so essentially what we have at this point then is a very compliance capable solution, but there are going to be steps that we need to take and that for the customers to understand that remaining 20% that they need to configure for it, to essentially kind of turn the knobs and dials so they can match their own compliance policies and controls unique to their industry and to their business. So let's go back to that challenge of regulatory complexity and the many standards and regulations you're looking to comply with globally. In our previous example of just implementing one regulation like GDPR, what of those internal controls that we've already implemented and solved for in GDPR, how have we solved for those when it comes to things like the California Consumer Privacy Act and the New York DFS cybersecurity regulation or other similar regulations? What is really different about these new privacy regulations so that we can solve for those new requirements, and how can we take out some of that complexity? Today, many companies are still using manual spreadsheets or point-in-time assessments or leveraging audits that may be fairly infrequent and go quickly out of date, and that all poses only more risk. So some of the changes we're seeing in internal controls landscape here is again, finding solutions that do a few things. One, that they integrate and they can see across the systems where they're managing their information. Two, that they really have built-in control mappings and can provide real-time assessments of their control risks. And three, that they're automated and they are continuously scanning their environment so that they can flag any new risks or changes in the controls and configuration that really require their attention. So I want to talk a little bit about what do we mean when we say risk and compliance. And this is really more from a Microsoft and M365 example, but what types of risk and cloud controls are we talking about? So a few examples here when we're thinking from that particular example. On the left, we have a common starting point of information protection and governance. So we've talked about this massive data estate. These types of controls are going to be about how we discover what personal and sensitive information we have, where it's stored, and what's happening with it. It's where we're using labels and building policies to identify, protect content, prevent data loss, and manage the information lifecycle. So considering from that remote workforce perspective, we might be thinking of configuring policies to limit or block access from unmanaged devices, or define how we're using sensitivity labels and DLP policies that help us block and restrict to secure how we collaborate with our external partners. We may also be blocking actions like downloading content to USB devices or blocking the saving of content to unsanctioned apps and services, for example. An insider risk, this really hits at the core of what keeps many of us up at night. We have solutions that we're all familiar with, looking for external threat actors and hackers, malware and phishing and so on. But how are we solving for those risks that our insiders pose, whether inadvertent, perhaps an employee trying to access or share information right now in this remote environment and placing it in an unintended location, or perhaps one with more malicious intent. And either scenario is resulting in that same challenge and risk of the inappropriate handling and leakage of sensitive information or even corporate IP. Similarly, our companies all have a code of conduct that we expect all employees to adhere to and to encourage behaviors that support a healthy workforce. So how are we thinking of controls like that to detect potential violations in our communications that will put our company at risk? These could be things like insider trading or harassment and bullying and similar. So how are we leveraging our tools and capabilities to really surface those risks? In Discover and Respond, we're thinking about types of solutions that will solve for how we issue legal holds across our data estate, how we search for and respond to litigation, how we support privacy inquiries like data subject requests. We also need to be aware of how and what activities are audited so that we can see who saw what, did what, and when to support forensic investigations when that's relevant. And finally, the foundation here is compliance management. How can we simplify compliance and map our regulatory and compliance obligations to the processes and tools and controls that solve for them? And how can we track and report on those, whether it's with Microsoft or any of our other third-party vendors? So what I'd like to do from here is take a look at how we do this at Microsoft in a brief demo. But again, whether we're leveraging the tool that I'll be walking through or any other, this is simply kind of helping us with a visualization of how we break down those different regulatory requirements to the recommended actions and controls that we can put in place to manage compliance in the cloud. So let me see if I can do a little. Okay. So once we click through here, we're coming into a tool that we call Compliance Manager. And as we land on this overview page, you can easily view and assess your overall compliance posture with this compliance score, the 71%. This score really allows you to quickly understand your progress in meeting data protection regulations and regulatory standards that matter most to your organization. And as we mentioned in that shared responsibility model, the majority of the score comes from these Microsoft managed actions and provides many of the built-in data protection controls in a service like M365 to secure your data. But organizations still need to take those actions to implement effective controls and meet their regulatory requirements. So, what we're seeing when we come in here, just for a frame of reference, is a baseline for based on some common regulations and standards like NIST and ISO, FedRAMP, GDPR. And I see in the middle here the key improvement actions that require my attention. And then, you know, as this continues, it's going to continuously scan my environment and flag anything additional that needs my action. If I scroll down the page, I can also see my score breakdown by category, such as protect information, govern information, manage devices. This helps us look at different goals or to take a lens to look at individual programs and understand how they're contributing to our organizational compliance by different categories. And then I can switch to look at the different assessments I've completed. Here I see my score breakdown by the different regulations and standards like GDPR, CCPA, and similar. So let's get a look at what it would take to set up an assessment. So what we provide out of the box is really about 150 or so assessments that you can use to begin to review those particular regulatory requirements and the recommended improvement actions. So we're going to add an assessment. In this example, we'll use GDPR. And then we'll create a name for our assessment and assign it to the appropriate group. And then we'll quickly review and create that assessment. And now that it's created, we'll view some of the control details in our testing status. So I can now see that control information associated with this assessment and the different control families and can kind of click into and see the status of the controls for the assessment, each grouped by these control families. And if I scroll down further into a control family, for example, the Organization of Information Security, I can drill down into an individual requirement like our mobile device policy or recommendation. And now I can see a breakdown of those key improvement actions in addition to all of the actions that Microsoft has taken to meet these controls on the right-hand side here. And if I click into the action that's being managed by Microsoft, I can find this detailed implementation notes and the test notes from Microsoft. You can see here on the far right. And if we go back and choose an action that's automatically monitored by Compliance Manager, or we're going to pick one, sorry, that isn't monitored. And so I'm going to come back and pick a failed test status. And so we're going to search for those failed controls to enhance our compliance readiness. And I see here the mobile device policy. So I can click through and it's telling me to require mobile devices to use a password, and I have a failed and medium risk test status here. On the left-hand side, you can see that relationship of the controls to one or more regulatory requirements. So you can see that control mapping, again, like removing that need to do duplicative work. And I can learn more about what I can do and the controls that I have in this particular system to solve for this requirement. So I could do that quickly by going into this Launch Now deep link. Alternatively, I could also pick a control that requires an update manually, such as requiring mobile devices to wipe on multiple sign-in failures. And similar to that last action, you can see there's clear guidance on how to implement the control. The difference is that it's not automated in this case. So what I would do is be able to go in and update the control status myself. I could assign it to an owner who can help implement and assess those controls. And as the team takes an action or plans an action, I can change that implementation status. Or I could even indicate that I'm using some other alternative service to solve for this particular control. So, you know, it need not be, in this case or in this tool, always a Microsoft solution to do so. I can pick my implementation dates, to record those dates for audit reports and so on. And similarly, my auditors could even come in and help assess and mark their test status dates in here as well. And then once it is now passed, I will get those points reflected in my overall score. So here I'm getting 27 points from completing this action. I can upload evidence, supporting documentation, and so on to help capture that full record and full picture of how I've solved for that. So when I go back to the overview, I can see my scores increased from what I've just implemented. So that's just a little bit that I wanted to show you. And to kind of recap here, you know, leveraging cloud services is one way that we're all adapting to this remote everything environment. And as we've been discussing, it's critical that we build in controls that make this environment secure and compliant. It's only through that we will trust and adopt these solutions, and that customers will trust us with their data. Where possible, we want to simplify compliance by understanding what's built in and native to a service and part of our connected environment. In most cases, that step alone will allow us to reduce costs and remove complexity. Additionally, we're harnessing the potential of our data and driving more effective business decisions as we leverage the intelligence and automation to manage our compliance controls and to classify and protect our information. It's really what's going to help drive intelligent insights and allow our businesses to scale. And by doing so, we're freeing up our companies to focus on their business, collaborate, and derive innovation. So through all of this, we're helping them respond and thrive in this environment that's really full of unknowns right now and requires us to adapt quickly and effectively respond to business disruptions and be more responsive than before.